92,850. Say that number out loud. That is not a projection. That is not propaganda. That is the confirmed count of Russian soldiers killed or wounded in a single winter, December 2025 through the end of February 2026, verified publicly by the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces. 3 months, 1 winter, nearly 93,000 casualties. And here is what makes that number genuinely staggering. It was not the worst part of Russia's winter. The worst part is what Ukraine did while Russia was bleeding out on frozen ground. There is a specific strategic shift buried inside this story that almost no major outlet covered with the depth it deserves. It changes everything about what the spring and summer of 2026 looks like. We will get there. Start with the mathematics of destruction. According to General Alexander Syrsky's public figures, Russia sustained 92,850 casualties across those 3 winter months. Divide that by 92 days, and you get 1,031 Russian troops eliminated every single day. 1,000 soldiers per day in a season Russia had specifically designed as the foundation for a triumphant 2026 campaign. The plan was to emerge from winter with momentum, with reserves intact, with a military machine primed to push deep into Ukraine's east. What Russia emerged with instead is a catastrophe measured in human bodies and burned equipment on frozen ground. And the number that makes it worse is not the total, it is the rate. Because 1,031 casualties per day is not a sustainable tempo for any military on earth. And Russia is not any military. It is a military already running on diminished reserves, a stressed recruitment pipeline, and an economy that was showing structural fractures before this winter even began. But the manpower numbers are only the beginning of this picture, because there is a second set of figures that arrived from a completely different source, and they are, if anything, more alarming for Moscow than the Ukrainian military's own estimates. Western officials cited by the Times reported that Russia was losing approximately 40,000 soldiers per month between November and January. That figure is higher than what Ukraine's own military was publicly claiming. And then came the finding that cuts to the heart of Russia's strategic problem. For the first time since the full-scale invasion began, Russia is now recruiting fewer volunteer soldiers than it is losing on the battlefield. Think about what that means. The pipeline that was supposed to be refilling Russia's depleted units is running below replacement rate. Every soldier who dies or is wounded represents a permanent subtraction from the force Putin was counting on to drive the spring offensive. There is no reserve shelf being restocked. There is a shelf being emptied faster than it can be filled. That is the first layer. Hold it. Because beneath it, the equipment losses tell an even deeper story. 322 tanks destroyed in 3 months. At first encounter, that number might register as significant but manageable. It is not. Russia produces and refurbishes approximately 400 tanks per year in total. Of those, many are older Soviet-era T-80s being pulled from storage and patched back into service. Vehicles designed in a different era, running on aging components crewed by soldiers who may have received weeks of training rather than years. The newer T-90, which Russia actually manufactures from the ground up, rolls off the line at roughly 250 units annually. What this means is that a single winter of combat wiped out the equivalent of an entire year's worth of Russian tank production. And that accounting does not include 430 armored combat vehicles destroyed, 110 multiple launch rocket systems reduced to wreckage, 2,967 artillery units eliminated, and 11,927 additional vehicles, trucks, motorcycles, transport units that Russia has increasingly relied upon as its armored capacity has been systematically gutted over 4 years of war. Russia entered this winter with a war machine. It came out of it significantly degraded, not symbolically, mathematically. Read that again. Nearly an entire year of tank production, gone in 90 days. The aerial dimension compounds the picture in ways that will matter enormously through spring and summer. Ukraine crippled 55 Russian air defense systems over the winter, opening corridors that are not just symbolically important but operationally significant for drone and missile strikes in the months ahead. 5 Russian aircraft were destroyed, 1 helicopter. On the drone front, 65,269 Russian drones were eliminated. These were not just weapon systems. They were the eyes and nervous system of Russian frontline operations. Surveillance platforms that tell commanders where Ukrainian units are moving, strike assets that hit supply lines and troop concentrations, coordination tools that link infantry to artillery in real time. Strip those away and Russian tactical coordination degrades measurably. The battlefield becomes darker for Moscow. And Ukraine, a country operating without a functional conventional navy, still managed to destroy a Russian warship and a submarine, continuing the systematic dismantling of what was once the Black Sea Fleet. That fleet has been driven so far from its former operational base that it now maintains virtually no presence in the Black Sea, a navy strategically erased by a country without one. Now hold all of those numbers, the casualties, the tanks, the drones, the ships, because there is a specific detail buried underneath all of this equipment data that changes the strategic picture entirely. It is not about what Russia lost. It is about what Russia was trying to achieve when it lost it. And that distinction is where this story turns. The Atlantic Council published a detailed analysis on February 26 documenting Russia's actual strategy for the winter of 2025 into 2026, and the strategy was not primarily military, it was psychological. The plan was to make Ukraine unlivable. Relentless bombardment of civilian energy infrastructure, power stations, heating grids, industrial systems that keep a modern country functioning in sub-zero temperatures, not to take territory, not to achieve a military objective on a map, but to strip Ukraine's civilian population of heat, electricity, and the minimum conditions for normal life. The goal, as the Atlantic Council documented, was to break Ukrainian morale so completely that Ukraine's leadership would have no rational choice but to seek terms. Putin was not trying to win on the battlefield this winter. He was trying to freeze Ukraine into surrender. He was betting that a population deprived of warmth in the coldest months of the year would demand that their government end the war at any price. The scale of the attempt was extraordinary. President Zelensky released the figures: 738 missiles, 14,670 guided aerial bombs, and nearly 19,000 attack drones launched at Ukrainian territory across those 3 winter months. The single largest attack came on December 6th. 700 aerial targets in one coordinated strike, including more than 50 missiles, all aimed at infrastructure. That is not a military operation designed to take ground. That is a campaign against a civilian population designed to break will. And it failed. Ukraine absorbed the strikes, its people endured through the winter, its military held the line, and with spring arriving, Ukraine will now spend the warmer months rebuilding the exact infrastructure Russia spent winter trying to destroy. Every missile Russia fired, every drone it launched, every ruble it spent on that terror campaign, it bought nothing. The country it was supposed to break is still standing, still fighting, and now, for the first time in over a year, advancing. That is not a setback. That is a strategic defeat at the level of core assumptions. Russia committed enormous financial, material, and operational resources to a specific objective. That objective was not achieved. The generals in Moscow who built the 2026 campaign around a psychologically broken Ukraine are now facing a spring against an opponent whose morale held, whose military stabilized, and whose counterattack has already begun producing results that nobody in Moscow planned for. But the story does not stop with the terror campaign's failure, because while Russia was launching missiles at Ukrainian power plants, something else was happening on the ground that Moscow had not anticipated at all. And this is the development that has received the least attention relative to its actual significance. The Institute for the Study of War tracked Russian territorial gains throughout January and February with systematic precision. Between January 1st and February 19th, Russian forces seized 572 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory, roughly 220 square miles. The open-source monitoring project Deep State, affiliated with Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, reported even lower figures: 245 square kilometers in January and 126 square kilometers in February. That February figure was the smallest monthly Russian territorial gain since July 2024. Add all 3 winter months together, and Russia captured approximately 430 square miles of Ukrainian ground in exchange for 92,150 casualties. Work out the arithmetic, and you get approximately 237 casualties per square mile of Ukrainian territory captured. 237 soldiers killed or wounded for every square mile gained. And the rate of gain was shrinking every month while the rate of loss continued to compound. Russia was paying more and getting less. Every month of winter made that equation worse. Every week of February made January look like a success by comparison. Here is what makes those territorial figures even more significant. And this is the detail that almost no coverage led with. Russia Matters, which systematically tracks ISW data over extended periods, confirmed that over the previous 12 months, Russia's average monthly territorial gain was approximately 171 square miles. That was already a historically modest pace for a military that had committed this level of resource and manpower. In February 2026, even that modest average collapsed. According to ISW analysis cited by the Washington Post, Ukraine liberated more land in the final 2 weeks of February than Russia managed to seize across the same period. The supposed aggressor, the side that launched this war, that has been pushing forward for 4 years, that has been absorbing Western sanctions, demographic strain, and international isolation specifically to continue this advance, was net negative on territory in the final stretch of winter. The direction of the conflict, measured in square kilometers, had reversed, and the reason is Ukraine's counterattack. If you have been watching the underlying data and skeptical of the narrative that Ukraine was simply holding on, the February numbers gave you specific, verifiable reasons to have been right. Toward the beginning of February, Ukraine's air assault forces, working in coordination with dedicated drone units and assault groups conducting search and destroy operations, began pushing aggressively into the gray zones and occupied territories in southern and southeastern Ukraine. A major offensive along the Oleksandrivsk axis was launched, still underway as of this recording, pushing toward Zaporizhzhia and in the longer strategic arc toward Crimea. The objective was not just territorial recovery measured in square kilometers. It was the systematic destruction of Russian military formations and the liberation of ground that Ukraine could fortify as defensive depth across Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts. Ukraine was not just pushing forward, it was building a defensive architecture that would make future Russian advances in the south exponentially more costly. By February 20th, the counterattack had already delivered results that exceeded the initial projections. Ukraine had liberated 300 square kilometers, roughly 115 square miles, in a matter of weeks. 8 settlements retaken, each one now functioning as both a fortified defensive node and a forward launching point for deeper pushes south. 2 days later, on February 22nd, General Syrskyi announced that the liberated area had grown to 400 square kilometers, including regions recaptured from Russian control in late January. 400 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory taken back, while Russia's own monthly gain collapsed to 126. Taras Chmut, head of the Comeback Alive Foundation and a member of Ukraine's Defense Procurement Agency Supervisory Board, put it in terms that cut through every layer of strategic analysis. In a post published on March 1st, he wrote that Russia had lost the battle for winter and Ukraine had won. His words, "For the first time in months or maybe years, Ukraine started to free more territory than to lose." For the first time since Ukraine's counter-invasion of Russia's Kursk region in August 2024, Ukraine is liberating more territory than Russia is capturing. The balance of this conflict, for this moment at least, has shifted, not marginally, measurably, verifiably, in the direction nobody in Moscow expected. Let that sit. Now think about what Russia's winter was supposed to look like. Energy strikes shattering Ukrainian will. Ground pressure building steadily toward Ukraine's fortress belt in the east. Recruitment pipelines refilling depleted units ahead of spring. Reserves assembling, rested and ready for a decisive summer campaign. Every single one of those assumptions has been broken. The energy strikes failed. The ground offensive generated catastrophic casualties for minimal gain and then reversed direction entirely. The recruitment pipeline is running below replacement rate. The reserves that were supposed to be preserved for the decisive moment are being deployed ahead of schedule and dying at over 1,000 per day. What Russia planned and what Russia got are two entirely different wars. This is the moment to ask the question that defines everything that comes next. Russia knows the winter failed. What does it do now? Zelensky has already answered part of that question. And the answer contains something extraordinary that deserves more attention than it has received. Ukraine has reportedly obtained Russia's operational plans through 2027. Speaking on March 2nd, Zelensky outlined the directions Russia intends to pursue: continued pressure toward the occupation of Donetsk and Luhansk in Ukraine's east, movement toward the Zaporizhzhia region, pressure toward the Dnipro corridor, and an aspiration toward the Odessa region in the south. A broad, ambitious operational vision extending years into the future, encompassing virtually the entire eastern and southern arc of Ukraine. And then Zelensky added the line that crystallizes Russia's actual predicament. These maps, for now, have nothing in common with reality, because they cannot accomplish the tasks. Russia has a plan. Ukraine has read the plan. And the winter just demonstrated that Russia currently lacks the capacity to execute any meaningful part of it. Picture yourself in a planning room in Kiev. You have just received intelligence confirming Russia's operational objectives for the next 2 years. You know where they intend to push, in what sequence, with what forces. And you have just watched those forces absorb 92,850 casualties in a single winter while failing to break your civilian population or gain meaningful ground. The plan is ambitious. The army implementing it is degraded. That gap between what Russia intends and what Russia can actually field is the central strategic fact of 2026. Here is where the picture becomes genuinely alarming for Moscow, and where the structural layer beneath the battlefield numbers starts to show its full weight. According to reporting drawing on deep state figures, Russia has assembled over 100,000 soldiers for its anticipated major push into Ukraine's east. 100,000 troops sounds formidable in isolation. It is not formidable in context. Russia deployed 170,000 troops specifically to take Pokrovsk during the summer of 2025, a concentrated massive force for a single fortress city, and it took months of grinding, costly combat to achieve. Now Russia is attempting to penetrate the broader Donetsk fortress belt, which is more heavily fortified than Pokrovsk, with 70,000 fewer soldiers. The fortress belt that Ukraine has spent years building, layered with obstacles, drone corridors, artillery positions, and reinforced defensive nodes that have absorbed and punished every Russian advance. Nobody in Moscow has offered a convincing public answer for how that arithmetic produces a different result than the last 4 years did. The ISW has confirmed that Russia has already begun preliminary artillery operations in Ukraine's east, probing and softening positions in preparation for a deeper push into Donetsk. The offensive is coming, but it is coming from a force that is smaller, more depleted, more expensively recruited, and more economically constrained than anything Russia originally designed its 2026 campaign around. And there is a second dimension to Ukraine's southern counterattack that has been underreported in almost every analysis of the current situation. Ukraine is not just liberating territory in the south, it may be forcing a choice on Russia that will shape the entire spring and summer campaign in ways that extend far beyond the southern front itself. Every Russian soldier sent south to retake the settlements Ukraine has liberated is one fewer soldier available for the Donetsk offensive. Every unit diverted to deal with Ukraine's energetic and ongoing southern push is one less unit available to penetrate the fortress belt that Russia has publicly committed to breaking. Ukraine is not fighting on one front while Russia fights on another. Ukraine is creating a demand for Russian resources in the south that competes directly with Russia's stated primary objective in the east. The strategic logic compounds with each additional square kilometer Ukraine liberates. More liberated ground requires more Russian attention to retake it. More Russian attention on the south means less available for Donetsk. Less available for Donetsk means slower gains against a fortress belt that already punishes concentrated assault. Ukraine is playing for compounding pressure across multiple axes simultaneously. Russia is reacting. Now here's the deepest layer of this story, the one that most coverage never reaches, because the battlefield and the recruitment numbers tell you what is happening today. The economic picture tells you what is coming. Alexandra Prokopenko, a former advisor to Russia's central bank and now a fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, published a landmark analysis in The Economist in February 2026. She described Russia's economic situation using a phrase borrowed from high-altitude mountaineering, the death zone. In climbing, the death zone is the altitude above which the human body cannot acclimatize. Above that line, the body does not adapt, it deteriorates. It consumes itself faster than it can recover. Rest does not help. Acclimatization is not possible. The only options are to descend or to die. Prokopenko applied that framework to Russia's wartime economy with specific, documented precision. Russia's GDP has stagnated. Oil revenues have been cut roughly in half by Western sanctions and low global prices. Russia's Urals crude was trading below $40 per barrel in December 2025 and barely above that in January 2026. According to Carnegie's analysis, every $10 per barrel deviation in oil price costs Russia between 19 and 23 billion in annual revenue. At $40 per barrel, that is not a stress event for the Russian budget. That is a structural revenue collapse happening in real time during an active war against a military that requires massive sustained spending to keep operating. The government's budget deficit is draining whatever reserves remain, and Russian officials have privately warned Putin that a financial crisis could arrive as early as this summer, not next year, this summer, while the spring offensive is still unfolding. But the most devastating part of Prokopenko's analysis is not the oil price or the deficit. It is the description of what Russia's economy is actually running on right now. She calls it military rent. Money transferred from the state budget to defense enterprises, factories producing tanks, missile systems, artillery shells, drones, generating wages and apparent economic activity, but producing assets that are ultimately designed to be destroyed. Tanks sent to the front and killed by Ukrainian drones. Missiles fired and intercepted by air defenses. Drones shot down by the tens of thousands. Unlike oil revenue, which introduced real value into the Russian economy from external sources, military rent is pure internal redistribution directed toward destruction. Nothing is being built that persists. Nothing is accumulating. The economy is generating activity, but that activity evaporates on the battlefield. Prokopenko's formulation is precise. The body is metabolizing its own muscle tissue for energy. Russia is not building wealth. It is converting existing wealth into destroyed equipment at an accelerating rate, funded by a budget that is simultaneously losing its primary revenue source. What does that mean for the people filling their energy bills, managing household budgets, watching the cost of goods move in response to global supply chain pressures? It means Russia's ability to sustain the bonus payments that have driven volunteer recruitment is deteriorating. It means the financial architecture that has kept Russia's military functioning at scale is under pressure that will not ease as long as oil prices remain low and sanctions remain in place. It means that every tank Ukraine destroys costs Russia not just the metal and the manufacturing. It costs the recruit payment that put a crew inside it, the budget allocation that produced it, and the strategic reserve that was supposed to be available for a later, more decisive moment in the war. Russia is spending its future on a present that is not delivering results, and the bill is coming due faster than Moscow publicly acknowledges. The signal's visible in the data right now. The casualty rates running above replacement, the recruitment shortfall confirmed by Western intelligence, the oil revenue collapse documented by Carnegie, the deployment of reserves ahead of schedule, the The failure of the winter terror campaign, the territorial reversal in February, these are not isolated data points from different parts of the conflict. They are part of a single compounding picture that has been building for months and is now visible with a clarity that did not exist before this winter. The analysts and institutions whose entire function is reading these signals accurately were flagging this convergence before the headlines caught up to it. Prokopenko's death zone framework. The Atlantic Council's documentation of the failed psychological strategy. ISW's systematic data showing Russian territorial momentum collapsing month over month. The Western intelligence assessment that Russia's recruitment has fallen below its casualty rate for the first time in the war. Each of those analyses arrived independently. Each of them points in the same direction. What comes next will be determined by how quickly Russia can reconstitute forces for the Donetsk push, and whether its budget can sustain the operation long enough to produce results before the financial pressure Prokopenko describes reaches a point of visible crisis. Ukraine's calculation is the inverse. Maintain southern pressure that forces Russian resource allocation away from the east. Rebuild energy infrastructure through spring and summer, fortify the defensive depth in Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk that the counterattack has opened, and exploit the intelligence advantage of knowing Russia's operational plan through 2027 to pre-position against every axis Russia intends to push. The next data points that will tell this story are already being generated. Russia's recruitment figures for March, its territorial gains in the first weeks of the Donetsk push, its budget execution rate as spring operations begin. Prokopenko's summer crisis warning has a specific timeline. That timeline is not hypothetical. It is approaching, and what it shows when it arrives will either confirm the trajectory visible in this winter's data or complicate it in ways that nobody is currently projecting from either side of the front line. 92,850 casualties, one winter, a terror campaign that failed to break a civilian population, a recruitment pipeline running below replacement rate for the first time in the war, an economy in what one of Russia's own former central bank advisors calls the death zone, and an army now assembling for its next offensive with fewer soldiers than planned, a budget under structural pressure, and a military roadmap that the country it is fighting has already read. The spring will answer what the winter raised.